I just want to make sure the techno works. Can you see the next slide? Is that visible?
Yes. Yes, too loud.
Okay, good. Okay. It's always a challenge to make sure that the techno works, and I appreciate Jerry mentioning some of the techno challenges because I live rurally outside of Perth, so rural internet is a challenge, something that you gentlemen in Oakville don't have to deal with. But I had to come into the library in Perth to make sure that my internet connection would be stable enough to connect with you in Oakville. So we're going to talk a little bit about the overall about the United Nations, the evolution of peacekeeping, and again a little bit about the future of the Canadian defense. So I'm sure that a lot of you have visited the United Nations headquarters. It's not just the headquarters of the United Nations, it's also a museum, it's an art gallery, it's a place that was, the land itself, the 17 acres was donated by the Rockefeller family. And the tall building that you see there is the Secretariat building, and then you have the other two buildings associated with UN headquarters in New York. Every morning, all of the flags are raised. They're listed in English alphabetical order, and at 8 o'clock every morning, the flags are raised in front of the UN headquarters. Now, I want to give a little situation to understand the United Nations. You have to understand what went before it. And so we'll have to take a step back in history and look at the League of Nations. So the League of Nations was the first worldwide organization. Its principal mission was to maintain world peace. And you can appreciate that it was formed just after the First World War, the war to end all wars. It went from January of 1920 until April of 1946. Its mission was to prevent wars, settle international disputes, deal with labor conditions, just treatment of native inhabitants, human and drug trafficking, et cetera, all issues that we're still grappling with today. Now, the interesting thing is there are 4 US presidents in history who have won the Nobel Peace Prize. This is quite topical, isn't it? Because there's one who's vying to win one now. So the first was Roosevelt, who deferred a Russian-Japanese war. The second one was Woodrow Wilson, both for his efforts to end the First World War and to create the League of Nations. And then you have Jimmy Carter for his humanitarian works, especially after he was president, and Barack Obama awarded in the first 9 months of his career. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, the League of Nations failed for a number of reasons. It lacked the military to enforce the sanctions and the resolutions that they passed. There was an unwillingness to apply sanctions to other members. Japan, Germany, Italy, and Spain left in the 1930s, so they departed. The USSR was joined in 1934, and then it was expelled when it invaded a neighboring country in 1939. The US, who was one of the main driving forces, the architect behind this, failed to join. They could not pass it through their Congress. And effectively, the bottom line is the League of Nations failed to prevent World War II. So it's important to understand why the United Nations was formed in the way it was based on lessons learned from the failures of the League of Nations. So it was founded after World War II to maintain international peace and security, to develop friendly relations among nations, to cooperate in solving international economic, social, cultural, humanitarian problems, and to promote human rights. This was especially done in 1948 after the Human Rights Declaration was made. So it's made up of 193 sovereign member states to discuss common problems and vote on major issues. The member states work together in a universal, impartial international organization. What is supposed to be a universal, impartial international organization. So the United Nations, member states are bound by the Charter, and the Charter is effectively an international treaty that guides the work of the United Nations, including peace and security activities. So these are the 6 principal organs of the United Nations: the General Assembly, which is a little bit like a House of Commons, the Security Council, a little bit like a Senate, the Secretariat, that's like the international civil service dealing with the running of the United Nations, the Economic and Social Council dealing with all international and social issues affecting all member states around the world, the International Court of Justice, not to be confused with the International Criminal Court in The Hague. This is an International Court of Justice to deal with any legal problems between member states. So you have to be a member state of the United Nations to take your case to the International Court of Justice. And the last one is the Trusteeship Council. I don't normally mention this because it inherited a
Lost the signal.
They managed to settle all those, and they became, so we had Nauru and Palau and Cameroon and all these types of countries that were initially colonies that then became individual sovereign states. And my first UN peacekeeping mission was with Namibia, which was previously German Southwest Africa, and that was one of the great success stories of the United Nations. It ceased its need to be in existence in 1994 because it had done all the work it had to do. And so therefore it was, I would say, put on holding status, and they meet once a year just to say, do we need to meet again? And that's it. Now I mentioned this Trusteeship Council because I heard an interview with Lloyd Axelworthy a couple of weeks ago, and he was proposing reconstituting the Trusteeship Council as the organization that has the background to deal with shepherding an entity into statehood, and that might be the place to deal with the situation in Gaza and Palestine. So the General Assembly, it's the main deliberative organ of the United Nations, consists of all members of the UN, one country, one vote. They meet annually, they're meeting now, and you remember what you probably heard over the course of the summer was a number of countries that said, when the UN meets in September, we are going to make our statement that we support the two-state solution for Palestine, or we will recognize Palestine. That is being done now in the month of September when the UN General Assembly first meets. So this is how it's set up. They meet, so they're organized in English alphabetical order. Every year they'll draw a name from a hat. Let's say it's Yemen, and then Yemen will get the spot at the very front, and then they will proceed in English alphabetical order through Zambia, Zimbabwe, and then start through Afghanistan, Albania, et cetera, et cetera. So you don't have the same countries and the same front row all the time. Everything is tried to be fair and just. Then you have the Security Council. So the Security Council is the UN body with their primary responsibilities for maintaining peace and security. You have permanent and rotating members. So you probably heard about the Security Council and about the veto power. So the permanent members, the 5 permanent members, are those that were successful at the end of the Second World War. So you have the United Kingdom, France, China, USSR, and that's been passed to Russia and the United States. Those are the 5 permanent members. And if they don't like a resolution which is brought ahead of the Security Council, they can veto it. If they're not really too sure about it, they're not really keen on it, they can simply abstain and it can proceed. But if they vote against it, then it vetoed, and that stops it. So France and the United Kingdom have used their vetoes the least. They haven't actually used a veto since 1989. Russia and the United States use their vetoes quite frequently. Then you have a rotating membership. So you have a total of 10 other rotating members. They're from various geographical areas around the world. Canada is in the area of Western Europe and others. So it normally happened about once a decade, Canada would say, it's time for us to have a seat on the Security Council, and we would apply, and normally we would get it, except for the last 2 times we have tried. We have been defeated by Portugal, Ireland, Norway, and Germany in those roles. So Canada has not had a seat on the Security Council, both under Prime Minister Harper and under Prime Minister Trudeau. The Security Council may investigate and recommend peaceful measures to resolve disputes between states. And if the Security Council determines there's a threat to peace and security, it can take additional coercive measures. So here's, and this room was, I think it was donated and furnished by Norway. So the Secretary General is basically the UN Secretariat is headed by the Secretary General. He's the Chief Administrative Officer of the organization. It started out with Mr. Trygve Lie from Norway, and it then proceeded on to Dag Hammarskjöld. The idea was that each Secretary General would serve for a period of 5 years. If it was successful, then he would be offered another period of 5 years. Lee did not have the confidence of the United States, so he resigned, and then Hammarskjöld from Sweden took over from him. He's often viewed as probably one of the most successful of all the Secretary Generals. He did receive a Nobel Peace Prize that was awarded to him posthumously. He was killed in a plane crash that was still under suspicious circumstances in 1961 when he was on a tour through the Congo. He was replaced by Mr. U Thant, who was from then Burma, which is now Myanmar. He served a total of 2 tours for 10 years. And then Kurt Waldheim, a rather controversial thing with some Nazi connections from Austria, but he served 2 consecutive tours for 10 years. Then Javier Perez de Cuellar from Peru, again another 2 years. And then it went to Boutros Boutros-Ghali from Africa, the first time from the African continent. He did not have the confidence of the member states, so they looked around for some replacement, and Mr. Kofi Annan replaced him. Now, Kofi is special because he is the first member of Secretary General to be what we call in the military commissioned from the ranks. He came up through the system, and he served two consecutive tours. So that meant that Africa had a total of 15 years. Then he was replaced by Mr. Ban Ki-moon from South Korea, and he did another 10 years. And what you see is everything is geographic representation. We try to switch it up so that it's not all from one particular area, and we try to be fair. Sorry, I was actually going to say, then when it came time for Mr. Ban Ki-moon to be replaced, the thought was, okay, time for a woman. There had been women who had been proposed over the years, Indira Gandhi, for instance, but it never quite happened. And they're saying, okay, it should be somebody maybe from Eastern Europe, maybe from some South America, whatever. But the consensus was that it would be Mr. Antonio Gutierrez from Portugal. Sometimes you just can't find consensus between the member states. So he recognized that there would be disappointment in that because he's not a woman, and so he quickly appointed women from 3 different geographic areas, from Nigeria, from Brazil, and from South Korea, into 3 key roles in his organization. And then later, a few years later, he appointed Rosemary DiCarlo from U.S. as the Undersecretary General for Peace, Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. However, we have had a Deputy Secretary General, and the very first Deputy Secretary General under Kofi Annan was Madame Louise Rochette, who is Canadian, and she had quite a distinguished career, both being as a Deputy Minister of National Defense and as Canada's ambassador to the United Nations. So the United Nations, as I mentioned, is not just a center of organization for peace and security. It's also an art gallery, a museum, because many countries or organizations have donated things. So this is a beautiful glass sculpture that was made by Marc Chagall. Yes, that artist that you probably have heard his name. He did it out of glass, and to commemorate the death of Dag Hammarskjöld and the other 15 members, the United Nations members, who were killed in a plane crash in 1961. That's at UN headquarters in New York. As is this. This was initially an artist from Luxembourg, initially planned to be commemorating after the death of John Lennon. What a great symbol for the end of war. You have a nod in the barrel of a Colt. But then they thought, well, it's too likely to be damaged if it were in strawberry fields. So the government purchased that, so it's on the grounds of the United Nations headquarters. Also across the road is a quotation from the book of Isaiah saying, "Thou shalt beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not take up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." The idea is that if you have an organization with a focus on peace, this would be, and this statue as well as on the grounds of the United Nations, ironically donated by Russia, as a picture representation of beating swords into plowshares. So now let's talk about peacekeeping. The United Nations, when it was first formed, They had no intention of dealing with peacekeeping. That was not part of the UN Charter. But it was Lester B. Pearson, who we in the military think of as the father of peacekeeping, who actually proposed it. And the interesting thing, so the Suez Crisis came up 11 years after the end of the First World War, and nations against nations. Nasser, president of Egypt, nationalized the Suez Canal. It created huge problems, shipping issues, nation against nation. France and Britain against the world were all kinds of problems. And so then enter into the fray Lester B. Pearson, who said, well, maybe we should send some lightly armed troops. Now, the UN had deployed military observers, but this was different because he had proposed sending lightly armed troops to enter into to create a ceasefire and to enter into the fray between. And so then he said, yeah, in Canada, yeah, we'll provide some troops as well. Now, at this time, with this type of peacekeeping, the president, the prime minister of the country into which they were deploying had the right to accept or defer or deny acceptance of any proposed peacekeeping troops. So President Nasser refused the Canadians. How could you refuse Canadians? We're Canadians. How could you do that? Well, if you remember in 1956, what did our flag look like? It was the red ensign. It had the Union Jack on there. And so a very important part of peacekeeping is to be impartial and to be seen as impartial. And so President Nasser said, well, you're going to favor the Brits because you have the Union Jack on your flag, so we don't want you. Well, quickly a compromise was reached, and we didn't send combat troops, but we sent logistics troops instead, and we participated in that peacekeeping mission. And Lester Pearson was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts to this end. So for the first while, Canadians, we were synonymous with peacekeeping. For the first 50 years of peacekeeping with troops, we participated in virtually every UN peacekeeping mission. We primarily supplied what we call enabling units. So most countries, if they were, they could provide infantry units, that type of thing. But it was a lot more difficult to provide enabling units, engineers, logistics, hospitals, aviation, that type of thing. So we became specialists in that, and we deployed on virtually every UN peacekeeping mission. 3 in Egypt, the Congo in 1964, multiple missions in Haiti, the former Yugoslavia. At one time we had well over 3,000 troops deployed there, huge. Cyprus, we participated in that mission for virtually 30 years. Ethiopia, Eritrea, Rwanda, Cambodia, et cetera, et cetera. We went every time the UN asked, we went, until we didn't. So right now, Canada, I just checked it, and we have UN peacekeeping missions deployed 29 Canadians, 29. And that includes military, and they're primarily a few staff officers here and there, and military observers, and a few police. That's it. That's what so it's no wonder that we are not, that we have not been successful in having a seat at the UN Security Council, because Canada has basically not been participating in UN peacekeeping missions the way we were before. So peacekeeping for almost 50 years was traditional, classic. It was based on a resolution, some type of an interstate conflict. It was conducted after an agreement or a settlement or a ceasefire. He separated the forces, monitored the agreements, and it was primarily military. That's what it was. First 50 years, no change. And so it was an interstate conflict. The government is functioning. The government infrastructure is intact. Military and police are operating. The judiciary works. The prison system works. International rules are in place. There's minimum contact with the population and basically minimum involvement with the peacekeeping mission and any civilian agencies. So that's what it was for the first 50 years. And then it all changed because peacekeeping, because the way the conflicts changed. So they became intra-state conflict. Governments were ineffective. The state infrastructure, the judiciary, the police, the prisons were all breaking down. We have military function of factions and warlords. We have the proliferation of weapons, breakdown of international humanitarian law. They're intermingling the rebels with the population. We have a full range of civilian agencies. And IO is international organizations such as the Red Cross, Red Crescent, Red Crystal, or NGOs, non-governmental organizations such as Save the Children, Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. And the protection of civilians became a primary mission mandate. It was not part of the mission before, and so that if something happened and the rebels would go and attack some village, the peacekeepers had no mandate, no rules of engagement to intervene in that. Now that changed, and we do. As well, there was a huge change to provide, to have the resolution in 2000 to provide more women, urging member states in the UN to include more women at all levels, and urging the Secretary General to appoint more women as SRSG. So the Secretary General is at UN headquarters in New York, and each mission has an SRSG, Special Representative of the Secretary General, and that is like the head of mission. So they would be in charge of the military, of the police, of the humanitarian things, whatever, if there's elections to occur, all that type of thing, that is all under the Special Representative of the Secretary General. And noted as well, resolution 2015, a substantial link between women being given meaningful involvement in peace operations and the achievement of a long-term sustainable peace. Now, there are challenges to do this, and I'm only going to talk about one. Big thing, of course, is women trying to serve on a 12-month tour. Most peacekeeping countries, when they deploy, they deploy for a period of 12 months. That's a long time to be away from home. For Canada, we always deployed for a period of 6 months, and we absorbed the additional cost for the rotation. That was ours for the health and safety and the morale and benefits of the soldiers who deploy. And as well, we would give them a trip home in the middle of that. But some of the challenges are customs. So I just want to talk about this one interesting custom in Mongolia. When Mongolia, which, you know, when the USSR broke apart, then Mongolia was left saying, okay, now what do we do? And they decided, well, let's do peacekeeping, which is maybe a bit of an unexpected choice for a country which was headed by Genghis Khan over the years. But they said, okay, let's do peacekeeping. But in order to go on a peacekeeping mission, you must speak English, especially if you're going to be a military observer or to work at a staff headquarters. The policy in Mongolia was that women were not allowed to go on any English language training. If you can't learn English, you can't go on a peacekeeping mission. Yeah, that's the case. Now, the interesting thing is the Mongolian names are a little confusing. They have a lot of A's in them, and they're not necessarily gender specific. So it just happened at one time on one of the courses, there was not one, not two, but 3 women were inadvertently loaded on a course. So they thought, oh, all right, let's go. And that's how, and so they passed the course. They were successful in that and carried on and started serving in peacekeeping missions. And that's how you actually change the way that they'd done things before, just by happenstance. But the other big problem before was qualifications. We didn't have women who had achieved the qualifications in order to rise into some of the key roles in the United Nations. You have to be a platoon commander first, and a company commander, and a battalion commander. You have to have done all those particular roles. And women just hadn't done that until it changed. When I started giving this presentation, I was following the career of General Jenny Kenignon. And she is quite unusual because in the Canadian military, we have combat arms, infantry, armored artillery, and we also include combat engineers. So the combat engineers have to do everything that the infantry does, plus they build bridges and they're in charge of mine detection and detonation. Jenny Kenignon is a military engineer. She had deployed on peacekeeping missions. She deployed with NATO. She headed missions in Iraq. She'd been in charge of leadership roles in Quebec, all over the place. And I looked and thought, if we're going to have the very first female chief of defense staff, gosh, that should be her. And I'm not suggesting that they listen to me, but it was really important that the first one would be somebody who had the expertise to be able to fill that role. And things changed. 11 years ago, we had the first female Force Commander and Ban Ki-moon appointed General Kristen Lund from Norway to be the Force Commander in Cyprus. And now as well, we've had Major General O'Brien, who was the very first deputy military advisor. She'd done way more missions than I have, and she'd been everywhere, and now she's the deputy military advisor based on her expertise. It is imperative that we have that expertise. So I just went around to collect some information from some of my friends with whom I deployed over the years. And so this is from my friend Colonel Suresh Bardawar in Nepal. And he said that joint patrols with women peacekeepers on board that were conducted by UNIMID, and that's the mission in Darfur, have better success rates. And my friend Rati Pusparini said that having female military has increased the benefits of the team in the field. When we patrol, many local women and children, even the elderly, came close to share their story, especially in cases of gender-based violence. When you have rebel groups and the way to subjugate a village is to use rape and torture, then women, men, children, whatever, are afraid of anybody in uniform. Women, however, are less threatened. And my friend Imran from Bangladesh, he said, beside providing the important combat role, our female officers become a symbol of trust and confidence for the women and children of conflict-torn countries. I'm going to skip through these ones so I can go through. And my friend Bob Hannabury, it's kind of interesting because he's there on the left. So this is quite an old picture of him on the early days in a peacekeeping mission. And he was deployed with Wendy Clay, who's there on the right. She's the first Major General in the Canadian military. She's both a pilot, but a private pilot and a doctor. And so he said, in old-time peacekeeping missions, when everything was okay, but in modern peacekeeping, it's a whole different situation. We're interacting with the civilian population, and having women is very important. I'm going to skip through this one, and I just wanted to end with a friend. He didn't want to give his name or rank, but a friend of mine who's a colonel in Ukraine, and he's mentioning that how important it is that women, especially in Ukraine, you can appreciate that after the invasion of Crimea, the number of women increased significantly. In 2016, after they opened combat roles, it increased again. And of course, with the recent, 3 years ago, invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the number of women in the military has increased so that they are more than 2 times the number of the number of women in the military in Ukraine that we have in Canada. But the problem is that the situation is there are many societies where men cannot interact with women just based on religion or social customs or that type of thing. But women can approach women and they can deal with them, whether it's teaching them about mind clearing and mind awareness or dealing with their medical issues. And especially with the children, peacekeepers are far more approachable. And here. And here. And here I was up, and this is up in northern Côte d'Ivoire, the northern Ivory Coast. I might be the first Caucasian person that a lot of these young village kids had ever seen. And it's not just the military, it's well in the formed police units. So you have formed police units that are deployed to the United Nations as well. And they could be dealing with demonstrations or protests or aid to the civil power. And so in Liberia, it was first deployed in January 2007. The world's first all-woman formed police unit was deployed. And after about 9 years, the president of Liberia went to thank them for the deployment. He said that when they first deployed 9 years before, 1% of the police officers in Liberia were women. Based on the positive role models that he had here from the Indian Formed Police Unit, it was up to 17% over a period of 9 years. So women are deployed in all areas, military, police, and civilian, have made a positive impact on peacekeeping environments, both supporting the role of women in building peace and protecting women's rights. This is the way of modern peacekeeping. This this is a way that peacekeeping has changed significantly from what it was the first 50 years. And to act as role models in the local environment, inspiring women and girls to push for their own rights. I'm just going to go through these ones quickly. Let's see here. I'm going to stop for that one. And so from my perspective, this is me on my very first peacekeeping mission in Egypt. And I say, not men only, not women only, but modern peacekeeping needs a mix of qualified men and women involved in every aspect of the peace process. I include this slide because many people think of peacekeeping missions as being literally in hot areas. And so this was, I was stationed in the former Yugoslavia in was now Croatia, but I had to go down and visit our troops that were based outside of Sarajevo. We tried a couple of times to land in Sarajevo, but it was under attack. So we went and took a transport up the Mostar Road, but we got to this one place and we had to go in by armored personnel, carry the rest. You can appreciate how challenging it is to deal with a peacekeeping mission anyway, to find countries that are willing to go in to be impartial, to be professional, but it's even more challenging in a cold peacekeeping environment because literally there are a lot of countries that are just don't have the equipment, don't have the expertise, don't have the ability to go in these cold weather deployments such as this. And here I am. This was the Sarajevo airport at the time. It had it all sea containers around it with dirt, basically protecting it from barrage that was undergoing at the time. I also included this. If you ever travel to Ottawa, you'd see the peacekeeping monument, the reconciliation, the Reconciliation. So in 1988, all peacekeepers were awarded as well the Nobel Peace Prize. And I just wanted to say that women's participation in the peace building process increases by 35%, the probability that a peace deal will last for at least 15 years. And studies have indicated that increasing the percentage of women in peacekeeping intentions from 0 to 5 reduces the expected number of sexual misconduct allegations against the contingent by half. There's one of my last courses that I did. This is military, they love to learn. So this is a course that we talked about UN peacekeeping in N'Djamena in Chad. Now, you'd asked to give some of the ideas of what the future is of Canadian defense procurement. And so this is just my own perspective. As I say, I don't have a point of contact with the Canadian military right now. I've been following avidly what has been happening. And the big thing is diversify. Diversify because it's things have changed in the last, basically since 2005. Since the beginning of this year, things have changed quite a bit. And who we thought was our ally, that things have changed. So we really have to diversify. Can we do that this year? Probably not, because the government has undertaken to spend to meet our NATO goal of 2% of GDP. And so we have to spend another $9 billion this year. 2 billion of that will be in pay raises and that type of thing, but still there's a lot of procurement that has to be done. Will we be able to diversify right now? I think it's probably, in order to meet this 2%, we're probably going to have to do a lot of procurement based on standing offers, what we currently have, and then diversify will be happening down the road, hopefully not too far. But then it's not just 2%. Now the aim is to have to meet the 5% for NATO of GDP. So 1.5% will be on infrastructure, and then 3.5% on other defense activities. So I believe what will have to happen is that for the infrastructure, there would be joint benefits. So it could be a military or a sovereignty issue. It could be, for instance, if you saw in the second tranche of what the government is planning to do is to approve a deep sea port in Churchill, Manitoba. That could be have the infrastructure associated with developing that port and developing road and rail links or improving road and rail links might be part of that infrastructure, because that would mean that Canadian military and Coast Guard ships could sail there and could replenish there. So I'm thinking that in order to meet the infrastructure, there might be a joint military and sovereignty or other benefit. You've also maybe seen that the Coast Guard is going to be transferred from fisheries and oceans, and it will then be under the military. Our Coast Guard is not like the American Coast Guard, for instance. They're not armed. That's not the plan. But there would be a lot of economies. We do joint patrols. We have joint purchasing, icebreakers, that type of stuff. So the Coast Guard and their budget will now come under the military. We have to redevelop the Canadian defense industry, develop Canadian expertise to rearm Europe, which is what has been announced, that how Europe is going to meet their 5%. What we need is to develop a specific expertise in an area, and it might be drones, for instance, where they come to Canada to buy drones, and then we go to Germany or Sweden or Denmark to buy other things. It's also beneficial that we've appointed the Honorable Stephen Fuhr, who is a Canadian military pilot, whose background as a Secretary of State for Defense Procurement. So his aim is basically to help steer everything through the red tape of the Canadian defense procurement system. Now, I think probably I'm just going to end with this thing. I thought that you'd probably be specifically interested in about the F-35, because that has garnered a lot of attention. So it started quite some time ago. Under a Liberal government in 1997, Canada paid $10 million just to join the Joint Strike Fighter program. That just meant that Canadian businesses, Canadian entities, Canadian organizations were then allowed to bid on anything related to the Joint Strike Fighter. So we paid and that was just the first one. Then we had to pay a number of times over the years to continue to be part of that program. So I was under a Liberal government with Jean Chrétien. Then over the next years, under a Conservative government, there were price increases to the F-35. The government negotiated a sole source contract, and that was very controversial because it was the largest Canadian contract ever, and to give it sole source engendered a lot of discussion. And as a result, with that and the lack of transparency, the government was found in contempt of Parliament. So, as what quite often happens, the military becomes a pawn in the political realm. The same thing as it was, if you remember, back into the replacement of the Sea-King helicopter. It was supposed to be replaced. We were avidly waiting for that. The Sea-King helicopter, which was aboard the Canadian ships, was older than most of the pilots that flew it. It required 30 hours of maintenance for every hour it flew. We couldn't wait to get a replacement, but the government of Jean Chrétien said the first platform was we were against this, and the first order of business he did was to cancel the contract for the H-101 helicopter, which then made it take years and years to get a replacement. So often the military is caught in the middle between different governments that have different plans. So then it was the Liberal government, when they came in, their platform was that they didn't agree with the purchase for the F-35. They said we're going to cancel it. So the Liberal government was elected in 2015. They canceled the contract, and they undertook to have an open and transparent competition. Their initial plan was that it would be open to all other potential fighters except for the F-35. Then they changed their mind. And in 2019, they released a formal request for a proposal to purchase 88 fighters. And you appreciate over these years, the cost of the fighters has gone up quite a bit over the period of time. The decision would be made based on a point system, 60% for technical merit, 20% based on cost, and 20% based on the industrial benefit to Canada. So in 2022, the government of Canada announced that the Lockheed Martin F-35 won the competition, and the Saab Gripen came in second. So after years, decades of decision, going back and forth, the decision was, okay, we are going to get the F-35. Until 2015, due to US tariffs and annexation threats, the Minister of National Defense announced that the payment for the first 16 had already been made. We would get those ones, but for the remainder was to be determined, to be confirmed, and whether we would proceed with the another choice is now a possibility. That's really quite difficult because, as you can appreciate, if you were going to, we're obviously going to be purchasing the 16 because we're virtually paid for them already, so they're definitely going to come. We're getting a lot of pressure from the Americans saying you have to buy the F-35 because for interoperability. But with NATO, the NATO nations are going to be using a number of different fighters. You don't want to go necessarily with a Super Hornet because that's basically what they call a Generation 4. It's sort of like a little bit better than what we have. The Gripen and the French plane are what they call a Generation 4.5. They're better than what we have now, but it's the F-35 that everybody wants because it's the stealth. It's very expensive and it's Generation 5. So what's going to happen with the government, what they're going to do, I'm not sure. But to run 2 fleets of fighters is normally just not something they would do based on the size of our military. And if you'd asked me the question a year ago, I'd said, absolutely not going to happen. But it's now, I don't know. They're going to be making a decision very soon, and it's there is a possibility that they might actually do a mixed fleet, some F-35s and some Gripens. The advantage with the Gripen is that the Saab developed that for the Swedish army. The Swedes have a largely conscript army with a small regular force. The Gripen was basically designed that the conscripts would be able to maintain it. So the reason that you wouldn't normally have 2 fleets is you wouldn't want to have to train pilots on 2 aircraft. You wouldn't want to have to train mechanics. You wouldn't have to have spare parts for 2. But if it's that easy to maintain and the technicians can go back and forth, and as well, Saab is making all kinds of overtures that a lot of it would be built in Canada with Canadian parts and Canadian technical expertise, then I don't know. So I'm avidly waiting to find out what's going to happen. But it's I would have said a year ago, no way that they would have 2 fleets, 2 different ones. But now I'm thinking it's maybe possible. So that's what I have. And unless you have any questions about other aspects of what might be happening in the defense, or if you want to find out more information about the military itself or about the United Nations in general.
Al will relate any questions you've got to Sheila. Any questions?
Sheila, what are your thoughts about recruitment challenges in the military?
Yeah. Yes, excellent question. Yeah, thanks. I should have mentioned this. It's been a problem for the last couple of years that however many you're recruiting, you're actually losing more than that. So basically, we've been losing the number of in the military over the years, and so basically that's a huge problem. The enticement was a couple of years ago. They thought, well, maybe we'll change the dress regulations, and I think you might have seen some of that. They totally reorganized the dress regulations. That men could have a beard, that men could wear skirts. It was really quite a change, and the idea was that, okay, we'll make it that anybody could join, and it became quite a joke about when you wear a uniform, there are a lot of standards that you expect. The thought was, if we make things more, I don't know, we open up to all different things, that we might open it up to recruitment. That was not successful, and we've actually gone back to the way things were before. It always happens that when the economy is bad, the recruitment in the military increases. So there is that, and there was the thought that because we were giving a pay raise, especially at the lower ranks, it was touted at the very beginning that there was going to be a 20% pay raise, and everybody think, "Oh, that's great." It wasn't quite that, because the government makes some promises, and it wasn't quite exactly that, but certainly it was front loaded that the lower ranks would get a higher portion, which is quite fair. and the middle ranks would get some, and then the higher ranks would get a bit less. So, but it's still quite a substantial increase. So not that you join the military based on the money, but you certainly want, if you're a young private corporal, master corporal, you certainly want to be able to have a family. You want to be able to support your family without having to go to food banks, and that had been a big issue before. So certainly a pay raise is beneficial. As well, we've got a lot to overcome with some of these stories about sexual assault and things in the military. That was not something that I experienced. I mean, you saw things go around, but this was not something that was an issue for me, and I would gladly serve anywhere with the people that I served with before. But we've got a lot to overcome to say we're changing it. And because you talk to some parents and they say, I wouldn't want my daughter to join the military, because you hear all these stories about sexual assault. So we've got a lot to overcome with that, and recruiting. So it's definitely a problem. And I think we're still about 14,000 soldiers short of what we should be. So recruiting is definitely a problem, not just to recruit more people, but to retain those that we have. Yes, sir.
Go ahead. Would you like to comment on the lack of forces in the Arctic and the purchase of the submarines?
And yeah, well, the submarines, I was glad I never had to go on a submarine. That was, I'm not claustrophobic by nature, but it's not really a place I would necessarily want to be under the ocean at that time. So hats off to the sailors who do that. Canada has not had a very good reputation of taking care of the submariners. We bought used British subs that leaked and had all kinds of problems, and now we've got one sub that's operational. So we're finally looking at, and there's a lot of competition between Germany and South Korea to provide state-of-the-art submarines. And if that's the case, and they should actually, especially South Korea is very keen, and they're making some promises that they could have those submarines very soon. And if that's the case, we need those subs to do our Arctic sovereignty. And we need those subs, basically, if we're saying the North is ours, we have to have a show of presence. That's the submarine. And so that's why my speculation, I could be completely wrong on that, is in order to meet our NATO commitment, infrastructure is going to be joint. It would be an advantage that it could both be military and for sovereignty. That's why I think the seaport in Churchill, Manitoba is definitely an up and coming possibility for the government to pursue. And we're going to have an answer on the submarines, I think, basically very soon, either the end of this year or early next. Well, depending on what the budget goes, whether this government continues or not, I don't know. But the plan right now is to have an early decision on the submarines, because there's so much lead time.
I've got a question else. Sheila, just asking about the American F-35. My understanding is that the U.S. insists that they supply all the parts, that they do all of the repairs on the submarines. My concern would be if they decide at a given time that they don't want to do that, which is possible, that we would be very vulnerable again, because the U.S. government has not agreed at a given time to do the repairs and supply the parts.
And the software.
And the software, which is not a problem in Sweden.
Yeah, and that's why I figured that you would be interested when you talk about what's the future of Canada and defense policy. I thought that you would probably be most interested in the F-35. That's why I covered it a bit. And that's the thing, that a year ago you think, okay, well, the Americans have to agree to do the upgrade. That's okay, because they're our allies. They're our trusted ally. Well, things have changed, and that's no longer the case. So does Canada want to put all our eggs in one basket and only have the F-35, which would mean that if the Americans follow through. I mean, you've also heard that Trump has said, oh, when we sell F-35s to other countries, we'll diminish them, we'll reduce them by 10%. There'll be 10% as effective. I mean, those are things he said. Whether Lockheed Martin would do that, you have to figure they wouldn't. But to put all of our eggs, all of our fighter plane eggs in this one basket with the United States, where they could now, not something you would have thought a year ago, but they could actually say, okay, you're not going to get the upgrades. That's a serious concern. That's why for me, I think there's a distinct possibility that we might decide to diversify. Under normal circumstances, to have two fleets of fighter aircraft is really just not a good idea. But based on the lack of trust, we don't have the trusted ally in the United States anymore. So I would speculate, and they're making a lot of push that we have to have the F-35 because interoperability with NORAD. So what might happen is that Canada might say, okay, we're going to purchase these anyway. We've basically paid for these virtually now. We will use the F-35 for NORAD. We will use the Gripen for NATO. I don't know, but I think as well there is because I mentioned that in order to be part of the Joint Striker program, we had to pay money, and in order for the Canadian defense industries or other industries to be involved and to get any contracts, and there have been, and they will be getting some contracts, but not to build or maintain the F-35 in Canada. Not the way that the Swedes have said that we can do it for the Gripen. And if we can use Canadian steel and aluminum and Canadian technology and to build the Gripen and to redevelop the Canadian defense industry, especially aviation. I mean, I'm sure you all have heard of the Avro Aero, and you know that in the 1960s, the Avro Aero was at the very cutting edge of fighter design. And even if it was ceased in 1964, it still would have basically could have been in service now, only just being replaced. It was at the cutting edge. And so when Mr. Diefenbaker, based on a lot of pressure from the United States, canceled the Avro Aero and broke everybody's heart and destroyed every single drawing and everything of that Avro Aero, all of the Canadians, aerospace engineers who had been involved in that program, they all went to NASA. We lost a brain drain to go to NASA. Now that benefited NASA, that's great, but that meant that it took the guts out of the Canadian defense industry, especially the aviation portion. We need to bring that back, and we could do that certainly. And if we might lose some jobs in the auto industry because of tariffs. But if we get other better paying jobs in the aviation industry and help build a Gripen in Canada with the help of the Swedes, there's certainly some benefit. So it was a simple decision before because the F-35 was a Generation 5 fighter and stealth and all the military they want it. Now the situation I think is changed, and I'm thinking that of the 88 fighters that we're going to have, I don't think. Well, I think it's a possibility that they might not all be F-35, and that some very well might be the most likely choice, I think, would be the Gripen.